New York City. With a population of over 8.5 million people, it is the largest city in the United States. What if I told you that 850 of those people would die every year due to opioid overdose? It's a pretty startling statistic. While statistics like these can help to show the gravity of the situation, if they're focused on too heavily, then they might leave other things out. Let's see what I'm talking about. In the news today, you see a lot of headlines that are very intense, which really makes the reader interested in the story. While these types of articles can be useful to the general public, it also means that the stories of the individual people who are involved can be left out. So if you were to sit down with these people and create a set of questions to ask them, what would they say? Would their answers be different than what you expected? To find out, we'll have to go somewhere a little closer to home. We're here today at Mercy Hospital. Mercy is not only the largest hospital in Springfield, Missouri, but it's also a multi-state integrated health system. It also happens to be where I completed my service learning. As a volunteer in the emergency department at Mercy, I was able to interact with many different physicians, administrators, and patients. Some of the patients that I spent time with actually had conditions that relate to my project itself. Right now, I'm here to interview the woman who I volunteered with. She prefers to be referred to just by her first name, which is Jo Reed. She's a family patient advocate here at Mercy and has had her position for over 30 years. I'm also here to interview Dr. Guy Miller, who's also been in the medical field for over 30 years. In order to gain a different perspective on some of the questions that I wanted to ask, I also chose to interview Mayor Ken McClure. Unfortunately, I was unable to video Mayor McClure, so I will simply have to voice over for his answers. To start off my interview, I asked each individual if they had a certain experience involving the opioid crisis that they wanted to share.
The definition of the opioid crisis, as I see it, I've not seen any problems or in regards to the crisis.
The ones that stick out of my head are the ones with the families that I've had to deal with after we've had young people pass away from overdoses. I had two that stick out of my head because they were very, very young, in their teens. I also had one that stuck out of my mind. A group of teens were going to a funeral of another teen that had died of an overdose, and they were doing drugs before the funeral, and one of them overdosed.
The experiences I've witnessed with opioids are with people that are applying for jobs and cannot pass a drug test. So when you talk with employers and hear them saying, "Oh, I can't find people to fill the job," that has partly to do with drug abuse.
I really don't believe there is an opioid crisis per se. I think it's nothing more than journalistic sensationalism.
Next, I wanted to ask a question that would be specific to Dr. Miller. I wanted to ask him what his thoughts were on the CDC guidelines, as in my research I discovered that there was a lot of scrutiny surrounding how specific these guidelines were.
The CDC guidelines, like anything else that comes out from them, is a joke. You know, I don't know how they come up with the basis for their guidelines and some of the stuff that they do, and this is one of them. You know, I don't really need the CDC to tell me how to treat my patients, or my guidelines has been formulated by 31 years of practicing.
Yeah.
And I treat patients according to my examination of them and my talking to them. Yeah. So the CDC guidelines mean nothing to me.
After hearing Dr. Miller reject the guidelines from the CDC, I went back to Jo and Dr. Miller to ask them how Mercy Hospital itself might affect their prescription patterns or their routines.
I mean, we have certain rules set in place for just, we just have to follow the same rules we follow for just about everything else. I mean, we've had them come in and it's their third or fourth time. And so some of the doctors will put them on psych holds because it's a recurring event. And so we've had some issues arise with that.
They try to micromanage us okay, and tell us what we should and shouldn't do, and we have to follow this and follow that. So as far as I'm concerned, administration has probably less basis of telling me what to do than the CDC does.
Yeah.
For them to come down with a sweeping regulations on how all doctors will write prescriptions and take care of the patients, it makes absolutely no sense, because no two doctors see the same patients, see the same type of patients. So the administration just needs to not worry about it.
Seeing that all of the individuals that I interviewed had many years of experience in their line of work, I was very curious as to see what changes they have seen in the opioid crisis or policies surrounding the opioid crisis.
The state of Missouri is the only state in the nation that has not enacted a prescription drug monitoring program. That is a database that allows prescriptions to be tracked. It's a travesty that Missouri has not done that. It has been stopped in the General Assembly many times. So, the changes that I have seen personally is that municipalities are being allowed to create their own PDMP programs. That's been done through federal legislation that both Senators McCaskill and Blunt have sponsored. The city of Springfield was even able to pass one last summer. Admittedly, this is something that the state should be doing. However, this is what we have been able to do at our level.
Our physicians do not as freely give out medications as they used to. They're much more careful about it. And I mean, everybody has the right to pain control. That's in the HIPAA rules and regulations that we give is to one of the patient rights. But physicians are more on the soft side of Tylenol, ibuprofen. We're seeing more of that. But we do see a lot of drug seekers. That's been an issue for 20, 30 years.
The prescriptions written for opioids has decreased significantly over the last several years. And with the decrease of the opiates, you would expect a decrease in the opioid crisis or the opioid death, where in fact they've actually gone up.
At this point in both interviews, I was very confused. This is because all of my many months of research had told me that the prescription numbers were actually on the rise, and that physicians had become completely careless in their prescription patterns. So how could it be possible that the prescription numbers had actually gone down while the deaths had increased? I had to ask them both to elaborate on this to clarify.
People who they've made up this opioid crisis phenomena, the people who abuse drugs, continue to abuse them whether they get them from a doctor or not. So the prescriptions have gone down, so they go to the black market and get heroin and synthetic stuff like fentanyl, so that's where some of the deaths are coming. And they find that people who die from a drug overdose or whatever, they don't have just opiate in their system. They have multiple drugs. So these people are abusing multiple drugs, not just opiates.
Unfortunately, because doctors are writing less prescriptions and it's harder to get a hold of, they think that's part of why we see more of an increase in heroin use. Mm-hmm. Because that tends to be the street drug they can get a hold of, and it's cheaper than buying the pills on the street. Young adults. Most of the ones that I see are anywhere between 16 and 35, maybe 16 and 30. One thing that I have noticed a big change in this area is it's also becoming a larger deal in the Amish communities and Mennonite communities where it wasn't. But that's becoming more of an issue now with them too, with their young people.
Certainly the homeless have been impacted, but also people who have been unemployed. Another group would be people who have a legitimate need but just got hooked on the prescription.
I was slightly afraid to ask the next question to Dr. Miller and Joreen, mainly because it could be a touchy subject around healthcare professionals. But I still wanted to ask them, along with Mayor McClure, whether or not they thought the public was losing trust in physicians.
A lot of mistrust nowadays is because we have too great emphasis on what are your pain levels rather than what are your symptoms. This is because a patient's comfort is where doctors get rated. If a patient has high pain levels, then they are not going to rate their doctor very high.
Yeah, and again, that is your journalistic sensationalism and journalistic bias. Unfortunately, I have found that the majority of Americans can't think for themselves. They listen to the biased. It's not even news. It's biased information. Mm-hmm. Right? It's information that is spun in a certain way that they can't think for themselves, and they're told how to think. So I do see that, the doctors are bad for writing these things. Well, we don't write them willy-nilly for just anybody.
Yeah.
Someone doesn't come in here, with a sore throat. I don't give them a month's worth of OxyContin, for crying out loud.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think the news, they have an agenda, to pursue, and that's what they do.
Jo had a slightly different thought on this than Dr. Miller. She believed that it was because in the past prescription patterns had been so careless that the public still believed that was the case today.
I think they used to be at one time, because you didn't have as much awareness of the abuse, I think.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people still go back to that old, and I think a lot of people years ago felt like, well, as long as they're still functioning, they don't really have a problem. We'll keep prescribing it, or especially a lot of the older doctors, it was just, they kind of just freely wrote the prescriptions.
Yeah.
But I've seen like I said, I have seen a big change in that.
Yeah. It definitely hasn't been difficult to find people that are concerned with the opioid crisis. However, I wanted to ask each of these individuals what their biggest concern was with prescription regulation in the future.
Unfortunately, just like with anything else, sometimes they go overboard, and I see people that probably really should get some pain medicines that don't because the doctors are unsure.
Yeah.
And so, but just like with anything that gets abused by people, the people that really need the assistance sometimes get caught in the middle.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a sad,
So what is causing things to happen now is that you're penalizing the lawful people who need pain medicine relief, aka cancer patients, patients with significant, like rheumatoid arthritis, stuff like that. You're now restricting the amount and the availability of the medicine that they lawfully need and have been examined by a physician and determined that they need that. Now you're having people who have never seen the patient, never examined them. They're coming up with their own rules and regulations to do that. So what they're doing is they're making the lawful people suffer.
I spoke with Dr. David Barb, who is the president of the Missouri Health Association and also practices in Mountain Grove. Dr. Barb stated that since they do not have a PDMP in Mountain Grove, then he usually does not know what other types of medication have been prescribed to his patients in the past.
To wrap up all of my interviews, I asked each person what they would like to see in the future.
I think there's been more awareness. I think doctors, the younger doctors especially, are made more aware of that and the abuse and it's just become, because it's not just an abuse with prescription drugs, it's street drugs too, and alcohol and everything else. It's just becoming a larger problem. And so I think that being as there's a lot more awareness with it, I think I've seen a huge change, and I think it's going to continue to change. But I've seen it change since I've been in the field, and for the better. People, they're not freely giving out the medications, and that's how a lot of people get started on drugs. Is they just break a bone or have some kind of a medical problem. They get the prescriptions, they keep getting them, and then it spirals out of control from there.
I think one thing and I don't know if Missouri has done it quite yet, is every state should do it, I think most of them do, is all pharmacies should be hooked into a national database. So you hit a button, and this patient, if he gets a prescription from me here, some doctor in Jeff City, some doctor in Joplin, it pops up just like that. That will help more than pretty much anything.
Yeah.
That's where a lot of the problem is. You get these patients who aren't really even legitimate patients. And again, these are the bad apples that are making it unfortunately tough on the law-abiding good apple people. You can see where a person, not even saying a patient, because most of these aren't patients, they're con artists and they make money doing this. All right? And that's the national, where they can see where this patient is going to multiple doctors. You know, I had a friend of mine that was a drug enforcement agent. He said, you know what, we were talking about this is years ago. And he said, you know what, Guy? He said, your job is to examine patients and treat them to the best of your ability. My job is to catch them when they're fooling you. And so if you're not meant to be a DEA agent or you know, narcotic agent or whatever, take care of your patient, do the best. If they're doing something wrong, then that's our job. Yeah, and the other thing is, you know, having patients sign, which is what we're doing now and starting to do more, sign contracts where we can randomly check you. You know, and if you don't, you know, I fired a patient about a year ago. What happened was he went to the emergency room at one of the hospitals, and they did a drug screen on him, and none of the drugs that he was supposedly taking were in his system. So anyway, I see that as being positive. What I don't see as being positive is our government doing the same crap that they always do.
I still remain disappointed in the Missouri General Assembly. It's truly a travesty that nothing has been done by them. To the credit of the president, he has declared it a national emergency, so it's starting to get the attention that it needs. Since there's not a clear-cut answer to any of this, it all leads me back to a PDMP, which will give us a database about drug prescriptions. Then if a prescriber is doing something inappropriately, then they can be looked at individually.
So after hearing and analyzing all of the evidence given by Joe, Dr. Miller, and Mayor McClure, what sort of conclusions can be drawn? Well, for one, it's very obvious that Missouri is in desperate need of a state prescription drug monitoring program. It was mentioned to me by every single individual that I interviewed at some point in time. This brings me back to my favorite quote that Mayor McClure said to me during our interview, which was, "I don't know if it's more regulation, but it's more information that needs to be available." Awareness also needs to be spread about the harmful and addictive nature of these medications. It's not just the physicians who should know this, but also the patients in order to dissuade them from using the drugs in the first place.